Hello everybody. So this video is going to be over what is physically attractive. So, very often our friends and our parents and people who care about us are going to tell us that, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And while if you don't possess all of the things the ideals of all the things that we're going to talk about, you will certainly have a fantastic chance of finding people who find you attractive, who want to be with you. Even though that much is true, there tends to be a really high degree of agreement on certain things as to whether or not they make us physically attractive or not. Another way of saying what I just said is people agree a lot on certain things that are physically attractive. All right, so we're going to talk about those things. So first, all right, I'm going to share the screen here so you can get kind of the list. All right, so what is physically attractive? Well, both men and women do share some commonalities. All right, so both men and women tend to find a few things, specifically these things, attractive. All right, so and most of these things are, all of these things are universal as far as we can tell. So across the planet, all right, people, both men and women, prefer their mates to be more symmetrical than not, to show signs of sexual maturity. And I'm talking, again, we're talking about things that are physically attractive for. So when I say sexual maturity, I'm talking about signs of physical sexual maturity. I'm not necessarily meaning, well, he's an immature person. I mean sexual maturity. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And across the planet, people tend to prefer cues of health. All right, so things like clear skin and clear eyes. Now, I've put up here averageness, and I don't want you to mistake averageness for symmetry. The reason I put that there is because there is this documented preference for averageness. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, so thanks to photomorphing technology, we have the ability to take multiple photos and then create a composite photo, a photo that is essentially the combination of all the different photos that we've put together. And what we find is that the more photos morphed into a single one there are, the more attractive people tend to find the composite photo. So if we were to compare a single photo, a non-composite, so a photo of one individual, with the composite photo of 10 individuals, typically people find the composite photo of 10 individuals to be more attractive than the single individual. All right. Now, one of the reasons it's thought that that is the case is because of this averageness. So as we morph multiple faces together, we approximate what the average person looks like. And there tends to be this preference for averageness. Now, the reason I put it here next to symmetry is that part of the reason it's thought that we show a preference for averageness is that as we average across faces, we get a more symmetrical face. So let me explain symmetry just a little bit more. Symmetry refers to the degree to which one side of us, one side of our face, one side of our body, the degree to which one side of us is a mirror image of the other. Now, every single person has asymmetries. That means everybody has certain things about them on one side that are not an exact mirror image of things on the other. So, just to point out my own imperfections here, if you look at this ear, it's round, but if you look at this ear, it's kind of shaped. It kind of comes in and then back out. Apparently I have an elf ear on this side, whatever. But on this side it's nice and round. So there's a slight imperfection. You have imperfections yourself. In fact, you might even be able to notice them. For example, if you're a glasses wearer like me, have you ever noticed how when you take your glasses off and you set it down, and you set them down, all right? This might really sick. All right, and you do this, all right? The reason that happens, the reason they're unstable, is because very often what we'll do is we'll adjust our glasses to make them look even on our face, but our eyes are slightly offset from one another. And so as we modify our glasses to look even, we're misshaping them to not be even. All right? So, I mean, this is a result of an imperfection. And again, everyone has imperfections, okay? You look at my teeth here. You know, apparently I got a vampire tooth here, and this one's nice and rounded off. This one here. So you see, everybody has imperfections. Everybody has asymmetries. So everything on this side of the face that is not a mirror image of things on this side of the face is an asymmetry. And, you know, if you're a masochist like me, the wrong term. If you enjoy finding your own weaknesses and your own imperfections, then by all means, please search out your own asymmetries. But my point remains, symmetry is thought to be one of the reasons averageness is attractive. Because as we average faces together, those asymmetries go away. There are fewer and fewer asymmetries in faces that are composed of more and more faces. So composites have fewer asymmetries than non-composites do. All right. So it's thought that one of the reasons we prefer averageness is because we prefer symmetry. Now again, both men and women prefer symmetry in their mates. They prefer signs of sexual maturity, physical sexual maturity, and they prefer signs of health. All right. Now, men and women also have their differences. So men and women also differ in certain physical qualities that they find attractive or not. So, for example, signs of sexual maturity are not the same signs in men and women. All right. So signs of sexual maturity in men include things like a prominent brow. So what's a prominent brow? So if you look at a person's, whoop, throwing my notes around, hold on. If you look at a person's profile, all right, you'll notice that the why can't I think of the word nose? Nose goes in and then it comes back out a little bit. All right. Well, in sexually mature men, this brow comes out further. So, I mean, you see how it comes in and then back out. Well, if it goes too far out, then that tends to not be attractive. But if it doesn't go out far enough, then it's not a prominent brow and it's not considered attractive. All right. And that morphological change occurs around puberty. So when we become sexually mature, when men become sexually mature, out pops the brow. All right, and a prominent brow. The more prominent the brow, the more attractive the man, to a point. It gets to a certain point where it's no longer attractive. Square jaw. So to what extent do you see this kind of squarish shape between the jaw, between where the back of the jaw and the bottom of the jaw? Prominent chin. How big is the chin? Again, the bigger the chin, the more attractive, to a point. The more square the jaw, the more attractive. I can't actually say to a point because I've never read anything about a jaw being too square. But you know, chins to a point, brow, bigger chins to a point, bigger brows to a point. Relatively thin lips. Now, I have italicized relatively here because many of well, I won't say many, but multiple students have pointed out to me, well, I don't like a guy with no lips. Well, that's not what I mean. I don't mean no lips. Everybody likes a person with lips. But women tend to prefer that men have lips that are not as thick as their own. All right, so there tends to be a preference that among men for thick lips in women, but when compared to women, women tend to prefer men's lips be thinner than their Body distribution. So in general, women tend to prefer men's shoulders to be wider than their waist. That's the shoulder to waist ratio. So in general, women prefer men to have shoulders that are wider than their waist. There tends to be a preference for hip to waist ratio. Now what that means is, so you got your waist and you've got your hips. Women prefer men to have waists that are about as wide as their hips. So about 80 to 90% the width. They prefer men's waist to be about 80 to 90% as wide as their hips. So very much a kind of straight down look. So, you know, women very much prefer a look something this is just a random shape, but something resembling that. So, you know, the shoulders are broader than the waist, and the waist is about the same width as the hips. All right. There's also a preference for larger muscle mass. So women tend to prefer men who have more muscle, but that's only to a point. In fact, if the muscle mass gets too high, then women actually stop preferring it. So, you know, you bodybuilders out there, you can keep building muscle to a point, but if you get to a certain point, women stop preferring it. In fact, most women tend to find muscle mass beyond a certain point to be unattractive. In fact, you get this kind of curvilinear relationship. And what I mean by that is you know, you got muscle mass. I'm drawing a graph here. I'm going to show you. So here you've got muscle mass. So no muscle mass, extremely high muscle mass, and preferences. So this graph reflects women's preferences for muscle mass. So as muscle mass increases, women tend to prefer it more. All right, but after a certain point, as muscle mass continues to get higher, women's preferences start dropping. All right, so women tend to prefer higher muscle mass, but to a point, and beyond that point, it tends to hurt instead of help. And then there is a preference for voice, although reflecting on it, I don't know why I put that in there, because that's not a physical quality. Well, I guess it is a physical quality because it depends on the structure of your throat, your mouth, your larynx, your chest. So voice is a product of physical qualities, but in general there is a preference among women for men who have lower voices, and so men who have your higher pitched voice, and when I say higher, lower, I mean pitch. So women tend to prefer men with lower pitched voices. Now, what do men like in women? Oh, well, again, they like signs of sexual maturity, but again, the things that are signs of sexual maturity in women are not the same. So signs of sexual maturity in women include high cheekbones. They include a thinner jaw, so or a narrower jaw. So by that, you know, for men, you know, there's this down and then in. All right, that's that square jaw. But what's preferred in women is kind of more of a triangular, steep gradation from top of the jaw to chin. All right, so they prefer a narrower chin. There's a preference for a smaller, thinner jawline. There's a preference for a smaller chin. Body distribution. So just like women prefer men to have a certain hip to waist ratio, men tend to prefer women who have a certain hip to waist ratio. But the hip to waist ratio that men and women that men prefer in women is different. So you remember that women tend to prefer a high hip to waist ratio, meaning that the hips are about as wide as that the waist is about as wide as the hips. Men tend to prefer a low hip to waist ratio, meaning they tend to prefer the waist to be a smaller, to be not as wide as their the waist to be not as wide as their hips. So it's more of a, again, I'm just drawing crude shapes here, so please forgive me. All right. I'm not an artist. So they prefer, man, that's really jacked up, and I'm just drawing 2 lines. This is why I'm not an artist. But they prefer the waist to be narrower than the hips. And I mean, this is not even a correct representation of the proper percentage, because men tend to prefer a women's hips be about 70% as wide as their hips, and that's not bad. So that is a bad drawing, but it does illustrate the fact that men prefer women's waist to be narrower than their hips. All right, but again, the ideal width of the waist is about 70% as wide as the hips. So men tend to prefer women's waists to be about 70% as wide as their hips. All right. And that's regardless of overall body weight. You know, a woman could be 300 pounds, and if she has the right hip to waist ratio, she's going to be considered, based on all the work that we have, she's going to be more considered than a 300-pound woman who doesn't have that same hip to waist ratio. In the same way, you know, a 400-pound man who has or a 300-pound man who has a hip-to-waist ratio of 0.8 or 0.9 is going to be more attractive than a 400-pound man who has a hip-to-waist ratio of 0.6 or 0.7. All right. Now, there's also some, I put on here muscle mass because there typically isn't a preference. Men typically don't prefer a lot of muscle in women. In fact, there tends to be a preference for not necessarily higher body fat. Certainly men find some muscle tone attractive, but relative to men, they tend to prefer higher body fat percentages. And in fact, if you look at the healthy range of body fat percentage in women than men, the healthy range of body fat percentage in women is much higher. Well, not much higher, but it is noticeably higher than the body fat percentage, the healthy range of body fat percentage in men. And then voice, again, this one's the exact opposite though. So whereas women tend to prefer men who have low-pitched voices, men tend to prefer women who have high-pitched voices. Now, I wanted to make one final comment on something that tends to be kind of a sensitive subject for some folks, and that's body fat. All right, and there's some, you know, that people talk about, oh, you know, the media creates an unrealistic ideal, and sometimes that is very much the case. But there's some research indicating that women tend to think that men want them to be thinner than they are. And in fact, when women have been in certain studies, when women are asked, you know, to kind of draw their current body image, you know, concerning their body weight and their ideal, usually they draw a thinner figure for their ideal than their actual. But when men are asked whether they prefer a thin ideal, heavy ideal, they tend to trend more towards the average. All right, and in fact, that actually tends to replicate a norm of men's preferences. Men's preferences tend to shift to whatever they think is the average. All right, so men tend to prefer the average. So this is one way that media can change and negatively affect, you know, or I don't know if it's not necessarily negative, but to some people it would be, can bias, we'll go with that, can bias their preference for certain body fat percentages in women. If a man is only ever seeing super thin women, then what he thinks to be the perceptual system doesn't do a good job of differentiating TV from real life. So if he's always watching thin women, then his expectation of what is average shifts to the thinner side. If they don't watch TV so much, then, and they're only seeing women in real life, then again, their preference for average shifts to what's actually there. So yes, media can have a biasing and potentially negative biasing, depending on who you ask, effect. It again reflects this shift towards average. So men tend to prefer what's average. Now, there tends to be this idea that thin is always preferred, and that's what this slide is all about, because it's not always the case. There's several a number of studies that now demonstrates whether we prefer thin, so lower body fat, or plump, higher body fat. It really depends upon the availability of resources in the environment, and specifically what body fat says about the individual with regards to their access to resources. So in resource-scarce environments, there's not a lot of food. And in these environments, if you have a greater body fat, that means you have greater access to resources. You are able to become plump. So you are being plump in a resource-scarce environment conveys, hey, I have access to resources, and that tends to be preferred. So in those circumstances, greater body fat is preferred. And we'll talk about this in another video. Women across the planet tend to prefer men with higher access to resources. So in a resource-scarce environment, women use body fat as a cue of access to resources. In plentiful environments, they don't use it as a cue to access to resources. All right, or if they do, it means the opposite. Men use access to, men across the planet don't always care about women's access to resources, but in resource-scarce environments, a woman who has access to food and therefore is plumper is going to be better able to carry a child to term. If she's not able to eat adequately, if she doesn't have the ability to store fat and therefore she's not able to store nutrition, then she's going to have a more difficult time carrying an infant to term. So the idea is that part of the reason there's a preference for plumper women among men in resource-scarce environments is that those plumper women are going to be better able to carry children to term than thinner women. Now, if you are in a resource-plentiful environment, so there's tons of food, there are plenty of resources to feed everyone, then greater body fat actually tends to mean the opposite. So greater body fat conveys fewer resources. If you look at a country like America, the more fatty foods, the foods higher in sugar and salt content, these are cheaper foods. McDonald's is far cheaper than going to a restaurant where you can get high quality meat, high quality vegetables. So the cheaper thing is higher in salt, fat, and sugar. And so in a plentiful environment, those things that are high in fat, salt, and sugar are easier to get. They're not as expensive. So having a greater body fat percentage is probably is a cue of fewer resources, because that's what you primarily have access to, things that make you plumper. And so in these situations where you have a resource plentiful environment, greater body fat signals fewer resources. And again, women across the planet always care about how the access of the resource of a potential mate's. Women across the planet care about a potential mate's access to resources. So if you're in an environment, a plentiful environment where being plump conveys few resources, then that makes men less attractive. But being thin in a resource plentiful environment requires more money, so that conveys a different set of, it conveys different messages. So men in resource plentiful environments tend to prefer the lower body fat percentages. All right, guys, and that is it that I wanted. That is all that I wanted to talk about in this video. I'm a plump guy, so I feel the sting of I'm not exactly, freaking Brad Pitt or something. So I too feel the sting of not possessing all the ideals of what it is to be physically attractive. But on these things that we've discussed, people are fairly reliable in what they find attractive and what they don't. Now, one interesting caveat is that even though people, and this will be the last thing for this video, even though people, both men and women, tend to strive and prefer and find people who have the right body fat percentage, the one that conveys the right signals. Even though they really find attractive the one who has the preferred body hip to waist ratio, even though they really women prefer the men with the right signs of sexual maturity, and men prefer the women with the enough signs of sexual maturity. Even though there's a preference for the most attractive person, people end up typically with people who are typically about as attractive as they are. And this actually tends to be a good thing. In fact, people who, this is called the matching hypothesis, people who end up with partners who are about as attractive as they are actually tend to be in relationships longer than people who are very much mismatched. All right. So, ending up with someone who's about as attractive as you, certainly you're probably going to find them attractive. And if you do, and they're about as attractive as you, then you're probably going to have a longer relationship than if, you ended up with someone who was far more attractive or far less attractive than you. Now, there is a gender difference between how much importance men and women put on physical attractiveness. So when it comes to long-term relationships, so being in a relationship for a long time, men tend to put a higher value on physical attractiveness than their mate. In fact, the satisfaction of husbands is positively related to the attractiveness. So the more attractive their wives, the more satisfied they are. That relationship doesn't exist for women. So women, although there's ample evidence that women care about physical attractiveness, there's also quite a bit of evidence that women don't care about it as much as men do, specifically in long-term relationships. Now, in short-term relationships, men and women, same way. They both want a physically attractive person. But when it comes to long-term relationships, men prioritize physical attractiveness, women not as much. They do still care about it, but it's not as important. All right, and that is it for this video. All right, if you have any questions, as always, please send them my way. But other than that, take it easy.